Now for these new set of nodes, I put these 2 decades together. So for these ones, this is going to be the 1920s and the 1930s. Now there is something that I have to point out first, because this is going to be kind of the underlying theme of really this unit. After this war, we see the Russians fall apart, Austria-Hungary falls apart, the Ottomans fall apart, the Brits and the French barely hang on. Who's the only nation left?
United States.
It's us. We become the biggest world power when the war comes to an end. The Europeans have done a fabulous job destroying themselves. It leaves us as the one major world power. Now, those Europeans are going to have to kind of regroup, but at least in the early 1920s, it's just us. Yes, Cameron?
What was China doing during this?
What are they doing?
Yeah.
They had a civil war.
Industrial power, were they not?
No.
Wait,
They're
actually?
very agrarian. Now, we'll kind of talk about them a little bit later on. In the 1930s, they're going to have more of a stage in the world, but that's going to be a little bit later. 1920s, we're going to see some big shifts taking place. Now, even in the United States, we come out of the war as really one of the major victors. We are the world power, but we still have these people coming back that have seen horrific things, and we start thinking, things can't just simply stay as they are. Things are going to have to change. We're going to talk about really 3 big areas of change. First big area we're going to talk about are going to be some social changes that are coming our way. Now, I want to do this today just so you can kind of get an idea. We're going to do social changes today, and when I see you guys next week on Monday, and probably when I see you on Tuesday. I can probably wrap it up in those few days. We're going to then change, and we're going to talk about some political changes. Then we're going to talk about some economic changes. But for today and just the next few days, we're going to talk social. Now, first off, one big social change that we're going to see is this grand sociological experiment. Now, I call it an experiment because people have been kind of talking about this idea for decades before this. In fact, if you think all the way back, this was first semester, there was a group of people that started pushing this idea. This idea that maybe perhaps one of the biggest problems we have in America stems from alcohol. Now, this is what you're referring to, right?
Yes.
They start saying, we have these very honorable and decent men that would never act in certain ways had it not been for them drinking. Now, I'm going to ask you to think way back. You remember, there was a group of people that said, prohibition can change America.
Yeah.
Making alcohol illegal is just removing this vice. And maybe if we remove the vice, we'll remove the problems that come with it. Now, Cameron, do you remember who that was, or that group of people? I'd be real impressed.
Wait, who were they again? What was the question?
Do you remember who was that group of people that was pushing for prohibition even in the late 1800s? It's part of the progressive movement. You're absolutely right. I'll give you a hint.
Rum Runners? Or is that?
No, they're going to be helping the alcohol
Is
Is it
problem.
Henry Clay?
Is it a person?
Prohibition. Let me say it like this.
Isn't those,
It was a
like,
group of women. Do you happen to remember the women?
Is that from when I said it was a soup?
No.
No, like, aren't they the?
Oh, wait,
they're
I
the
remember.
Christian
Who
nuns.
was
The
it?
Christian nuns.
They're not nuns.
It's the lady with the hammer.
The Women's Christian Temperance Union.
Oh, so not that.
Yeah.
I was trying to remember the name of it.
Far
I
from.
remember the
Yeah.
Christian something.
These women have kind of been pushing for this for years. Now, remember, they had some kind of strange tactics to sort of prove their point. Do you remember what they would do to these men who were in the bars or in the taverns to show that alcohol was the problem?
Start
They
fights.
would beat them. They basically kind of start slow. They start just kind of being, a nuisance. And then they push these men off their bar stools. They knock the drinks out of their hands. And do you remember, what did these men do in response?
Fight them.
Eventually they got to a point where they would punch these elderly women. Now, again, this is going back to first semester, so I don't want to harp on it, but they do a pretty good job of proving their point where they say, look at this fine young man. He would never punch an elderly woman, except for the alcohol. Alcohol is the cause of all of these problems, the violence, the looting. This would never happen if it wasn't for alcohol. If we can just remove the vice, we'll solve all the problems. Now again, it's a noble little experiment because alcohol is a state power. State governments get to decide what their alcohol laws are. If you're going to make it a national movement, you need to give that power to the federal government. If you're going to give that power to the federal government, you need an amendment to the Constitution. Now, I want to ask because I got to highlight how difficult this is. So I want to ask you, do you know, what does it take to create an amendment, even today? You know, does Cameron know?
Both houses of Congress have to vote on it, and then it can either be, or does that have to do with the, yeah, it also needs to be.
Has to go through Congress, you're right.
Congress, and then it has to be either accepted or vetoed by the president.
Nope, president doesn't get any say in it.
So that's only laws.
That's laws.
That's laws.
Amendments are much harder. Drew, you know? The states have to approve it. Now, let me just tell you this too. Just to get it through Congress, you need 2/3 vote in both houses. It's hard. Then you send it off to the states, and the states have to approve it. The 18th Amendment is going to be one that passes in kind of a strange way in that it's a convention of the states. But what this amendment does is it makes the transportation, sale, consumption, and manufacturing of alcohol nationally illegal. Now again, a big sociological experiment. Let's see what happens when we get rid of all the alcohol throughout the entire country. Now, what a lot of the prohibition has said is, well, we're just going to remove the vice and the problems will go away with it. We think this will work. Now, again, you got to kind of take your hats off to them because, hey, maybe this does work. Maybe this creates a more moral society. It's an experiment. But we got to keep in mind what we just went through. We have people who just saw the most destructive war in the history of mankind up to that point. Now they come home. People want to enjoy life. They want to take their naps. People want to enjoy and live out the rest of their lives because you kind of have to think about what they saw. A lot of them just kind of had given up on life and they said, eventually I'm going to die in these trenches. It's going to happen. If they miraculously get out of there, they start saying, this is way too much government power. This is an intrusion on my life. You can't tell me what to do. People start thinking about, how can I get around this? Now, I always kind of equate this to something. If people want alcohol, you can get it. It's not necessarily that difficult to get your hands on it. It's just a matter of how you go about doing it. Because all of a sudden this alcohol is illegal, there are people that see a business opportunity. There is a market, there's a demand. All you got to do is supply that demand. Yes, Cam?
So I know something about a very political thing, I guess, sort of thing. One of our presidents actually, their family made a living off of this. It was the Kennedys.
Yes.
They made a living off of being
They made millions and millions of dollars. We'll chat about that.
Yeah.
If there's a if there's a market, you just got to supply it. A speakeasy is going to become a common vernacular of an underground bar or tavern. Now again, if there's a market, you can supply it. People want to drink, you've got to give them an opportunity, but it's against the law. So if it's against the law, you better make it worth their while. Yes, ma'am?
Wasn't it like you could sell whiskey, it just had to be like under a medical license?
Yes, you can get,
There's a
a
guy,
doctor can write you a prescription for
Yeah.
whiskey.
there's a guy he got his like medical license and he prescribed whiskey and then he'd hire someone to like grab his own, like hijack the whiskey truck that he was shipping out and then he'd grab his own whiskey and sell it for like legally throughout. So it was really smart thing. He was eventually caught, but he like hijacked his own shipments
Think of this.
to make more money.
It's a business, but it's now illegal. So if you have a business and people want to buy your product, it's illegal, you better make it worthwhile. These speakeasies, these underground secret bars and taverns had to be really careful because they're breaking the law. But if you're gonna do it, you better make it worth their while. People would come into these speakeasies and you had to be able to trust them. So a lot of times it went through kind of a process where you had to know someone that would trust you. So kind of think about it like this. If you're starting a speakeasy, the more people you bring in, the more money you make. But if you bring in one wrong person, your whole industry goes down and you get arrested. So you start by just having like your close friends in there. And then they have a friend they want to bring in.
And you gotta
And
know.
they have a friend you want to bring in. Now again, it's a balance because you got to say, I got to be careful, but I want to make as much money as possible. So you got to have some kind of safety measures. What a lot of these speakeasies would have is simply they were hidden. They were, on the side of a building. If you knew what you were doing, you'd go up to the door and you do the secret knock. You do the secret knock, and someone slides open this peephole here and just goes, "What? What are you doing? I don't know who you are." Then you got to say the password. Now, of course, every place had a different password. There was a bunch of different. A lot of them were very complicated. But then you say the password. They open the door, and you walk into this tiny little room. Now, sometimes you walk into that tiny little room, and you don't have the next step right, so they just beat you mercilessly. Other times they just say something to you, and you had to respond back. If you had the right response, they'd open this gigantic steel door, and there's a bar behind it. Now again, safety measures. Because in the world of the speakeasies, there are plenty of people there who want to either take your business, who have no problem removing competition, if you know what I mean. Organized crime starts getting involved in the speakeasy game. Organized crime, or the mafia, sees an opportunity. Now, I will tell you this. The mafia is really good at seeing things that are illegal, but still wanted by people. If it's illegal and still wanted, you have an opportunity to make a weird amount of money. And the mafia simply starts to get involved in the speakeasy game. They'd smuggle alcohol in from Canada, from Mexico, from Cuba, where it was legal. Bring it across the border, sell it in the United States. Now, this is one way of supplying your business. But there are plenty of other ways. Making alcohol, like creating it, is not necessarily that difficult. Now, I say it, I've never actually made alcohol before, just so you're aware, okay? Because making alcohol is actually, it can be really dangerous. If you know what you're doing, though, and you do it properly, you can make a very, clear product. If you don't know what you're doing, one, you can blow yourself up. It's highly volatile. It can explode. Or two, you can make an alcohol that's not pure, and if you drink it, you go blind.
Wait, what?
Yeah, because
If it had, I forget exactly, I think if it has like copper in it.
yeah.
Oh.
Copper, lead, whatever. If you don't filter it properly, it can be real bad. Now, I will tell you this little story. I have two friends, maybe I've told you about it. My friends Drew and Stu. Have I told you about these knuckleheads? I met Drew and Stu when I was in college, and they are literally from like the backwoods of Tennessee. I went to